My daughter gave me an ultimatum: serve her husband like a servant, or walk out of the home I paid for. So I smiled, packed my bags, and left without a single word of anger. The beer bottle sweated on the arm of my husband's recliner. Grant didn't look up from the football game. "Old woman," he said. "Grab me another beer." I stood in the doorway with 2 grocery bags cutting into my fingers. Cold air still clung to my coat. It was the 3rd week of September, and the sun had already dropped behind the rims, that long sandstone ridge that walls in the north side of Billings. I'd been at the pharmacy for 40 minutes waiting on a blood pressure prescription. My arms ached. Somewhere down the hall, the television was loud enough that I could hear the announcer calling a play before I'd even gotten my shoes off. "Excuse me?" I said. "You heard me." He glanced over, annoyed, the way a man looks at a red light he's stuck behind. "You're already standing." I set the bags down on the kitchen counter, slow and deliberate. My hands didn't shake. They hadn't shaken in a long time. "This is my house," I said. "My name is on that title." Grant smiled like the sentence amused him. He took a pull from the bottle he already had. Brooke came in from the hallway then. She looked at her husband first, then at me. She crossed the room and stood beside him, one hand resting on the back of the recliner, Walter's recliner, the one I'd hauled 400 miles from our old house on Clover Street because I couldn't stand to leave it behind. "Mom," she said, flat, even, the voice she used on telemarketers, "just get him the beer." I looked at my daughter, 33 years old, the girl whose wedding I'd paid for down to the last centerpiece, the woman whose mortgage my signature had been propping up for 14 months. "Then I'll pack," I said. Grant's smile widened, like he'd won a hand he didn't know he was playing. Brooke's face cracked just for a second. I saw it, the flicker of the daughter I remembered, underneath the mask she'd been wearing for the better part of a year. "Mom, wait!" I was already down the hallway. I packed fast and quiet. My medication first, then the folder of financial documents I kept in the closet, the one Grant had asked about twice and I'd never let him see. Walter's photograph from Flathead Lake, the one where he's squinting into the sun with a stringer of trout in one hand, went into my overnight bag wrapped in a sweater. His notebook came off the nightstand, the little spiral one where he used to jot down engine specs and grocery lists in the same cramped handwriting. I left the recliner. I couldn't carry it, and some part of me didn't want to. Neither of them said another word to me. I heard the television start back up before I reached the front door. I checked into the Dude Rancher Lodge off 27th Street a little after 8 that night. I remember the number on the door, room 214, because I wrote it on a hotel notepad next to a list of calls I intended to make. At 8:47 p.m., with steady hands, I started making them. 31 years in banking teaches you something people don't expect. Systems aren't emotional. A frozen transfer doesn't care how you feel about the person on the other end. I called my bank's after-hours line and froze the automatic mortgage remittance. I logged into the joint insurance portal and removed both their names from my policy. I called the credit card company and closed the account Brooke had been using for what she called emergencies. I ended every quiet, recurring transfer I'd been sending into that house for over a year, one by one, methodical, the way I used to close out a teller drawer at the end of a shift. Then I called my lawyer. Renata Shaw had represented me since Walter's estate went through probate, and she picked up on the 3rd ring, which told me she'd seen the number and known it mattered. "Renata, I need to talk about the house on Clark Fork Trail and the people currently living in it. Eleanor, are you safe? I'm in a motel, room 214. I'll call you back in 20 minutes. None of what happened after made sense to anyone standing in that living room that night. Not to Brooke, who still believed, I think, that I'd cool off and come back within a week the way I always had before. Not to Grant, who mistook my quiet for weakness because that was the only kind of quiet he'd ever learned to recognize. To understand why I packed a bag instead of raising my voice, you'd have to go back 3 years, to a hospital room on the 4th floor of Billings Clinic, and a Tuesday in February that started the whole slow unraveling. I'm Eleanor Voss. I'm 67 years old, and I never once raised my voice at either of them. That was my daughter's mistake. She grew up thinking my silence meant I had nothing left to fight with. Walter and I were married 38 years before the cancer took him. Pancreatic. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already finished most of its work. He was diagnosed in October and gone by the following February. 4 months that I measured out in appointments and infusion bags, and the particular sound the hospital's ice machine made at 2 in the morning. I sat in a vinyl chair beside his bed and counted things. Ceiling tiles, the beeps of the IV pump, the days, because counting kept my hands from shaking. Walter ran a small equipment shop off Main Street for 30 years, fixing balers and swathers for half the ranchers in Yellowstone County, and I spent 31 years as a loan officer and eventually a branch manager at First Rimrock Bank 2 miles from his shop. We ate dinner together almost every night of our marriage, and most Sundays he'd take me out to the shop after church just to show me whatever he'd fixed that week, some rancher's decades-old baler running clean again, proud of it in the quiet, uncomplicated way men of his generation were proud of things they'd built with their hands. I used to tease him that he loved that shop like a third child. He'd tease me back that I loved the bank the same way, that between the two of us we'd raised Brooke and 2 businesses, and somehow all 3 had turned out fine. We closed the shop the month after his diagnosis. I still have the key. I've never had a reason to use it again, and I've never been able to make myself hand it over to whoever bought the building. When he died, the house on Clover Street felt like a held breath. I'd walk from room to room at night, unable to sleep, and the quiet had a texture to it I'd never experienced before, not even after my own parents passed. Brooke called 2 weeks after the funeral. She and Grant had been married 5 years by then and lived in Billings too, 20 minutes across town from Clover Street, not the 2 hours some versions of the this story get told with just 20 minutes, but it might as well have been 2 hours, given how rarely I'd seen the inside of their house before that call. She said I shouldn't be alone in that big place. She said moving in with them made sense. I'd save money, they'd have help with the bills, we'd keep each other company. She sounded so much like her father when she said it, warm and certain, the kind of certainty that used to make me trust her completely. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I sold the Clover Street house within 4 months, which is fast for Billings in a slow season, but a widow's house with fresh paint and a manicured yard doesn't sit long. I cleared $198,000 after the mortgage was paid off, plus another $140,000 from Walter's life insurance policy. I moved into Brooke and Grant's place on Clark Fork Trail with my furniture, Walter's recliner, and what I thought was a plan for a peaceful last third of my life. The first weeks were good, or good enough that I stopped grading them so closely. I unpacked slowly, lining Walter's books along one wall of the guest room that became mine, and I paid to redo the kitchen the way Brooke had been wanting for 2 years. New countertops, a farmhouse sink she'd been pinning to some website since before her father got sick. I told myself it was a gift, not an investment. Looking back, I can see how thoroughly the two ideas had already started blurring together in that house, how every dollar I spent there came wrapped in some quiet, unspoken hope that it would buy me a place inside my daughter's life that grief had otherwise left hollow. Grant and Brooke had married 5 years earlier at a vineyard outside Red Lodge, a wedding I paid for almost entirely, $31,000, a number I remember exactly because Walter and I argued gently over the open bar line item for a solid week before I won. Grant seemed, at the time, exactly what I wanted for my daughter, steady enough, funny at the right moments, attentive to Brooke in the particular way of a man who can't quite believe his luck. I didn't see then what I learned to see later, that attentiveness and control can look from a distance like the very same thing. That first Thanksgiving in the house, 6 weeks after I moved in, gave me a small preview I didn't know how to read yet. Grant's mother, Carol, came up from Sheridan, and over pie Grant told a long, funny story about a coworker who'd gotten fired for skimming cash from a register, laughing the whole way through it, timing the punchline like a man who did this often. People always think they're smarter than the system, he said, still smiling, until the system catches up. Brooke laughed loudest of anyone at the table. I laughed too, because it was, in fact, a funny story, and because I had no reason yet to hear anything underneath it. Grant was polite at first. Distant, but polite. He worked at Yellowstone Valley Equipment Rentals, leasing out skid steers and generators to construction outfits around the Billings and Laurel area, and the job paid on commission more than salary, which meant some months were good and some months weren't months at all. Some afternoons he came home smelling like the inside of the Rex bar downtown. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Not at first, because Brooke seemed happy, or something close enough to happy that I told myself it wasn't my business to look closer. Looking back, the first real test came only 6 weeks after I moved in, though I didn't recognize it as a test at the time. Grant asked, almost offhand, whether I'd mind if he was added as a signer on the household grocery account, just for convenience. I said yes without thinking twice, the same automatic yes I'd have given my own daughter. 2 weeks later, $300 vanished from that account in a single Friday night withdrawal at a casino 2 miles from the house. When I mentioned it, mildly, Grant said the machine had eaten his card and he'd needed cash for a tow. I believed him, mostly because believing him was easier than the alternative, and because Brooke, standing in the doorway, was already nodding along, like she'd heard the story before, and had long since decided it was true. 8 months in, the trouble that had been sitting quietly under the surface came up for air. Brooke and Grant had bought the Clark Fork Trail house 3 years before I moved in, with a mortgage of $310,000 at a rate that had already started climbing by the time an adjustable period kicked in. They'd fallen behind, not by a payment or two, by 5, with a notice of intent to foreclose already sitting in a drawer that Brooke hadn't told me about until the day a man in a county vehicle came to photograph the exterior of the house for the bank's file. I remember standing in the kitchen holding that notice, feeling my whole chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with Walter, because I recognized the letterhead. I'd worked on the other side of letters exactly like it for 3 decades. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Brooke was crying by then, the real kind, not the kind she'd later learned to perform. I didn't want you to think we were failures. Grant didn't want you to think less of him. I paid it off. All $267,400 of the remaining balance wired from Walter's life insurance proceeds inside of a week, because I couldn't stomach the idea of my daughter losing her home over a number that, to me, after 31 years in banking, looked almost survivable. Renata drew up the paperwork. At the closing table, in exchange for saving the house outright, the title transferred solely into my name. My idea, not theirs. A decision born half out of caution and half out of the plain fact that I was the one writing the check. Brooke hugged me in the parking lot of the title company and told me it was temporary, that they'd buy it back from me once Grant's commission stabilized, that I'd always have a home there no matter what the paperwork said. Grant shook my hand that day too, both of his around mine, and told me he'd never forget what I'd done for his family. I remember thinking at the time that it was a strange choice of words, his family, not our family, but I filed it away as nothing, the kind of small linguistic slip a person makes under emotion, not the kind that means anything on its own. I understand now that it meant exactly what it said. I was never inside the boundary of what Grant considered his to protect. I was a resource course positioned just outside it, useful for exactly as long as the usefulness lasted. I believed her. I want to be honest about that, because too much of this story only makes sense if you understand that I wasn't naive by nature. I'd underwritten enough loans to know when someone's numbers didn't add up, but I was newly widowed, and grief makes even careful people generous past the point of good judgment. The foreshadowing came 4 months after the mortgage payoff, on a Sunday afternoon in June, though I didn't recognize it as foreshadowing at the time. Grant asked to borrow my car for the afternoon, said his truck needed a jump and he had a job walkthrough to get to. I handed him my keys without thinking twice. He came back 6 hours later, smelling like a bar and reeking of something I couldn't place until I found the receipt wedged in my cup holder 2 days later. A cash advance slip from a machine at the Crystal Lounge on Minnesota Avenue, dated the same afternoon, for $400. When I asked him about it, gently, not accusing, just asking, he looked at me with an expression I'd get to know very well over the following year. Wounded, disbelieving, like I'd slapped him for no reason. "You're going through my things now?" he said. "It was in your own car, Eleanor." I let it go. I told myself it was one afternoon, one bad decision, the kind anyone under financial pressure might make. I had no way of knowing yet that this was simply how Grant operated. Small tests first, checking how much scrutiny he'd tolerate before someone pushed back, and adjusting his behavior only when someone did. I hadn't pushed back, so he adjusted upward instead. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. By the following spring, the arrangement that had started as helping each other out had calcified into something else entirely. I was covering the mortgage equivalent payment I'd set for myself as a kind of informal rent, the grocery bill, both car insurance policies, and Brooke's credit card for what she called emergencies. There was always a different emergency: a transmission, a dental crown, a deposit on a wedding gift for a friend I'd never met. I want to be precise about the numbers, because vague resentment is easy to dismiss, and exact figures aren't. Over that year, the recurring expenses ran to roughly $1,760 a month, and the credit card emergencies added another $14,200 across 11 months, an average of $1,290 a month riding on top of everything else, charged to a card that was, technically, still in my name because Brooke's credit had never fully recovered from a repossession in her 20s that I'd also quietly cleaned up at the time. The escalation, once it started in earnest, came in stages, each one arriving right after I'd convinced myself I'd found my limit. The first stage was the loan that wasn't a loan. In August, Grant came to me directly, not through Brooke, which should have told me something, and asked for $2,800 to fix the transmission in his work truck. He needed the truck for job walkthroughs, he said, and without it, he'd lose the commission structure that made the job worth keeping. I wrote the check. He told me it would come back to me within 6 weeks, as soon as his next 2 paychecks cleared. 6 weeks passed, then 12. When I finally asked about it over dinner, casually, the way you'd ask about anything, Grant set his fork down with a small, controlled motion that I'd come to recognize as a warning sign. "I can't believe you're bringing this up at the table," he said, in front of Brooke, like I'm some deadbeat. "I just asked when you thought, you know what? Forget it. I'll figure it out myself." He pushed his chair back. "I don't need this from my own mother-in-law." Brooke reached over and put her hand on his arm, the universal gesture of a woman soothing an injury only she could see. She didn't look at me. That was the part that stung, not Grant's performance, which I was already starting to see for what it was, but Brooke's silence, the way she let it stand. The second stage was the way Grant began working on Brooke directly, turning her against the very boundaries that were keeping the household afloat. I overheard part of it one evening in April, standing in the hallway with a laundry basket, not eavesdropping exactly, just present. "Your mom controls everything," he was saying, low and reasonable, the tone of a man stating an obvious fact. "The house, the money, all of it. She likes it that way. Makes her feel needed since your dad passed. You ever think about that?" I didn't hear Brooke's answer, but I noticed over the following weeks a new coolness in the way she spoke to me about money. Not hostile, just distant, like she'd started keeping a private ledger of grievances I didn't know I was accumulating. The third stage was quieter and slower to notice, because it worked by subtraction rather than addition. My friend Susan, who I'd known since our daughters were in preschool together, used to come by on Wednesday afternoons for coffee. After the 4th or 5th visit, Grant started finding reasons to be in the kitchen the whole time we talked, refilling a water glass, checking his phone, once mentioning, unprompted, that he hoped Susan wasn't filling my head with anything. Susan noticed it too, eventually, and our Wednesdays quietly thinned out over the following months until they stopped altogether. I didn't clock it as deliberate at the time. I told myself I was just busy, that Susan was busy, that this was simply what happens to friendships once you move in with your grown daughter and inherit her household rhythms instead of your own. It would be over a year before I understood how much smaller my world had gotten, one canceled Wednesday at a time, and how much easier that made everything else that followed. The fourth stage arrived when I finally questioned a specific charge, $612 at an electronics store, on the card meant for emergencies. I asked, once, mildly, what it had been for. Grant answered before Brooke could, his voice rising just enough to fill the kitchen. "Are you serious right now? You're going through our purchases like we're children? Do you know how that feels? To be 60,000, sorry, I mean 34 years old and than have your wife's mother auditing your receipts? He said it in front of Brooke's coworker, who'd stopped by to drop off a casserole dish, and I remember the coworker's eyes sliding to the floor, the particular embarrassment of a stranger caught inside someone else's marriage. Brooke told me later, privately, that I needed to be more sensitive about how I brought things up, that Grant was under a lot of pressure at work. I apologized. I want to say that plainly, because it's not flattering. I apologized for asking where $600 of my own money had gone, because keeping the peace had become, without my noticing exactly when, the only currency that mattered in that house. The fifth stage used the oldest leverage there is. In May, Brooke told me she was pregnant. I cried when she told me. Real tears, happy ones, the first unclouded joy I'd felt since Walter's diagnosis. For about 3 weeks, the house felt lighter. Then Grant began invoking the pregnancy every time money came up. "You really want to stress Brooke out right now? In her condition?" became a sentence I heard so often I could predict its cadence before he finished the first word. When I asked in June whether we might revisit the monthly arrangement now that a baby was coming and expenses would only grow, Grant told me I was attacking a pregnant woman over spreadsheets. Brooke didn't correct him. I stopped asking. The sixth stage used a different kind of leverage entirely. In late June, Grant came home from an urgent care visit with a note diagnosing acute stress-related hypertension and held it up at the dinner table like evidence entered into a trial. "You want to be the reason I have a heart attack at 34, Eleanor?" I didn't have a good answer for that in the moment, because there isn't a good answer to a question built to have none. I set down whatever I'd been about to ask about that month's insurance renewal and didn't bring money up again for 6 weeks. Brooke drove him to 2 follow-up appointments that summer. I paid the co-pays without being asked, grateful, in some small humiliating way, for the chance to prove I still cared about his well-being after everything else. The seventh stage was quieter than the others, and it's the one I didn't understand the shape of until much later. Grant's phone had started lighting up during dinner with a name I didn't recognize, Ashford Rentals. The caller ID read, more than once, always answered on the back porch with the sliding door pulled shut behind him. Around the same time, a piece of mail arrived addressed to Grant Ashford at our address, not Grant Marsh, which I set on the counter and mentioned once, lightly. "Junk mail mix-up," he said, and slid it into his jacket pocket before I could look at it twice. I didn't press. I had no reason to yet. I only remember it because I am the kind of person who remembers things. A habit 31 years of underwriting never let me shake, and because 3 weeks later, on a Thursday in early September, Grant openly mocked Walter's recliner at a small family dinner Brooke's aunt was visiting, calling it the shrine in front of everyone, laughing, asking when I planned to let Walter go and get rid of the ugly chair. Brooke laughed along with him. A smaller thing happened that same week that I only understood the significance of much later. I discovered entirely by accident that the auto insurance policy I'd been paying for both cars had lapsed 2 months earlier, not because I'd missed a payment, but because Grant had called the carrier directly, using details he had easy access to as a household member, and switched the billing to a card of his own that had since been declined 3 times running. Brooke had been driving Ren's future car seat around uninsured for 8 weeks without knowing it. When I called to sort it out, the agent mentioned, almost as an aside, that Grant had also asked about removing my name from the policy entirely to simplify things. I had it reinstated and locked under my sole authorization within the hour, and told myself it was carelessness rather than intention, because the alternative was a harder thing to sit with that early in the year. That was the night, more than any single dollar amount, that told me where things were actually headed. 2 weeks after that came the beer, the recliner, and the sentence, "old woman," that finally moved me from patience into motion. By the time I sat in room 214 at the Dude Rancher Lodge dialing Renata Shaw's number, none of it felt sudden to me, even though I understood it would look sudden to everyone else. It felt, instead, like the last card in a very long hand finally being played. Renata called back in 19 minutes, not 20. "Eleanor, walk me through what happened," I told her. All of it. The recliner, the beer, Brooke's flat little voice, the 14 months of numbers I'd been keeping in my head because some habits from a career never leave you. Renata listened without interrupting, which was one of the reasons I'd kept her as my lawyer since Walter's estate. "You said your name is solely on the title," she said once I'd finished, "since the mortgage payoff 2 years ago. Then legally, they're occupants without a lease. No tenancy agreement was ever drafted?" "No, it was family. You don't draft a lease for your own daughter." "You do now," Renata said, not unkindly. "I can have a notice to quit filed by Thursday. Montana gives us some flexibility on notice period for occupants without a written tenancy. We'll go with 3 days given the circumstances, and I'll have it hand-delivered so there's no argument about service. They'll say I threw my own pregnant daughter into the street." "They might," Renata said. "So we document everything, every dollar. Can you get me records?" I could. I'd been keeping records the entire time without fully admitting to myself why. Bank statements, canceled checks, screenshots of the credit card portal, a manila folder in my closet that Grant had asked about twice and that I'd quietly built into an 1.5 inches of paper over 14 months. Because some part of me, the loan officer part that never fully retired, had known long before the rest of me was willing to admit it that I'd eventually need proof. What I didn't know yet, sitting in that motel room with the folder open on the bedspread, was that the mail addressed to Grant Ashford wasn't a mix-up at all. 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday I would later reconstruct from bank surveillance footage, Grant had walked into a branch of First Interstate Bank on the west end of Billings and attempted to take out a $50,000 home equity loan against against the Clark Fork Trail property, presenting himself as its owner, with a notarized affidavit bearing a stamp from a notary named Cheryl Dunmore, a notary whose license the state of Montana had revoked 11 months earlier for an unrelated matter involving falsified vehicle titles. The bank's underwriting team had caught the discrepancy within 48 hours, flagged the file, and quietly opened an internal fraud inquiry, the kind that moves at its own pace and doesn't announce itself to the person it's investigating until the investigation is ready. I only learned about it 2 days after I filed the eviction notice, when an old colleague from my first Rimrock days, Priscilla Nunes, who now worked fraud prevention at First Interstate, called me at Renata's office out of professional courtesy, since my name was listed as the title holder of record. Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me honestly. Did you authorize a home equity application on the Clark Fork Trail property? My stomach dropped somewhere I could feel in my knees. No, absolutely not. Why? She told me. $50,000. A forged notary stamp, a signature that was a passable but not perfect match for mine. Clearly traced or practiced rather than written naturally. The kind of forgery that fools a glance but not a trained eye. I sat very still in Renata's leather client chair and listened to a fact reorganize everything I thought I understood about the man my daughter had married. Priscilla walked me through the file 2 days later, back at the branch, on the other side of a desk I'd sat behind myself for 11 years before First Rimrock and First Interstate merged their back office operations. She showed me the surveillance still from the lobby camera. Grant, in a gray jacket I recognized, signing a form with a pen he'd clearly practiced with beforehand, his hand moving too carefully, too slow, the unmistakable rhythm of someone copying a shape rather than writing their own name. We catch this maybe twice a year, Priscilla said. Most people who try it aren't smart enough to also fake the notary chain. He was smart enough, just not smart enough to know we cross-reference revoked commissions automatically now. I signed a fraud affidavit that afternoon, my actual signature, deliberately slow, so there'd never be a question again about which one was real. That same week, a second piece of the picture arrived. Grant didn't just owe money on paper. He owed people who don't send polite reminders. I learned this from Callum Reyes, a detective in the financial crimes unit at the Billings Police Department, who'd been a friend of Walter's since their years playing in a Tuesday night bowling league at Skyline Lanes. Callum called me not as an official contact, but as an old family friend doing me a courtesy, the way small city relationships sometimes work in a person's favor. The calls to your landline over the past few months, he said, the ones you told me you assumed were spam. They weren't spam, Eleanor. They were collections agencies, and some of them weren't the kind that follow the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act too closely. Grant's been using your address and your clean credit history to look legitimate to people he owes money to. You're listed as a reference on at least 2 of the accounts. How much does he owe? We're still working that out. It's substantial. There's a private lending arrangement, not a bank, tied to sports betting activity. That alone looks like it's somewhere north of $38,000. And the calls to my house specifically started about 4 months ago, best we can tell. One outfit lists your landline as his employer verification contact. That's not something a person does by accident, Eleanor. That's something a person does when they've already started planning for the accounts under his own name to be worthless to him. I asked, because I had to, whether Brooke had known any of it. Callum went quiet a second longer than I liked. Can't speak to that yet, he said. We're not there, but nothing we've found so far puts her name on anything Grant actually signed. Just his. I filed the eviction that Thursday, exactly as Renata had planned. No tenancy agreement existed. My name alone sat on the title, and the notice gave them 3 days to vacate. They'll contest it, I told Renata. Then we document, she said. You have the grocery receipts, the insurance statements, the credit card records? I slid the folder across her desk, organized by month, 14 months of proof that I had been quietly funding a household that was, at the same time, quietly stealing my identity to fund a gambling habit and a forged loan application. Renata paged through it slowly. You're going to be fine, Eleanor, she said, and for the first time since the recliner, I let myself believe it. Move-out day was a Sunday, with a Billings PD officer standing at the curb as a precaution Renata had arranged in advance, given how the last conversation had gone. I didn't go inside. I sat in my car across the street and watched Grant carry boxes to a borrowed truck with his jaw set tight, refusing to look in my direction even once. Brooke came out twice, once carrying a lamp that had been mine before it was ever hers, which she set down gently on the curb without a word, a small, wordless apology I understood exactly as she meant it, and once just to stand on the porch for a minute, arms wrapped around herself despite the mild afternoon, looking at the house the way you look at something you already know you're going to lose. She didn't wave. I didn't either. Renata had warned me that any contact, even a friendly one, could complicate the restraining order petition working its way through the system, and some part of me was grateful for the excuse not to have to decide what my own face should do in that moment. The restraining order came through the following week, filed as a precaution once the forgery was confirmed, and Callum's unit officially opened a case that named Grant directly. Grant lost his job at Yellowstone Valley Equipment Rentals 4 days after that, when a routine background check, triggered, I later learned, by his own employer's insurance carrier tightening its policies after an unrelated incident with another employee, flagged the open fraud investigation and the mounting collections activity tied to his name. I thought, for about 6 days, that the worst of it was behind me. Then, on a Saturday morning in early October. I heard him before I saw him. I'd gone to my old branch of First Rimrock to sign some paperwork Renata needed notarized, and Grant was standing in the parking lot, unshaven, shouting to no one in particular and everyone at once that I'd thrown my own pregnant daughter into the street over a beer. I didn't stop walking. I crossed the lot straight toward him because I had spent 14 months apologizing for asking reasonable questions, and I had run entirely out of appetite for it. "Hello, Grant," I said, calm as anything, closer than either of us expected me to get. "How are the gambling debts?" His face went through 3 colors in the space of 2 seconds. White, then red, then something closer to gray. "I have documentation," I said, "of every dollar I spent keeping your household running for 14 months. Mortgage, groceries, insurance, your truck repair, Brooke's card. Can you show me documentation of where your paychecks went?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. A man in scrubs walking toward the urgent care next door slowed down, watching. A woman loading groceries into her trunk 2 spaces over had stopped entirely, one hand still on her cart. The man in scrubs said, not quite quiet enough, "Wait, is that true? He forged something?" And I watched something register on Grant's face for what looked like the first time in 14 months. The understanding that an audience existed which hadn't already been trained to take his version of events on faith. "You forged my signature," I said, quieter now, so only he could hear it. "You used a revoked notary. You used my name with people who break kneecaps for a living, Grant. I raised the daughter you married. I am not the person you should have tried this on." He turned and walked away without another word, which was, I think, the first honest thing I'd seen him do in 14 months. My phone buzzed 30 seconds later. Callum. "Eleanor, I need you to come down to the station. We found something going through Grant's financial records that you should hear from me directly, not secondhand." A pause on the line that went on a beat too long. "It's about Brooke." At the station, in a small interview room with a window that looked out on the parking lot where I'd just left Grant standing, Callum laid out what his unit had pieced together over the preceding 2 weeks. The forged loan attempt wasn't Grant's first. 9 years earlier, before he'd met Brooke, Grant had been married to a woman named Dana Ashford in Casper, Wyoming, a fact that explained, instantly and sickeningly, the name on the mail and the phone calls I'd noticed on the back porch. During that marriage, Grant had run a strikingly similar pattern against Dana's mother, a widow named Pauline Ashford, moving in under the guise of temporary help, running up debts against her credit, and eventually attempting to forge a lien against her property before Pauline caught it and the marriage collapsed under the weight of the resulting fallout. Pauline had never pressed charges, worn down by grief over her own late husband and reluctant to drag her daughter's marriage through a courtroom. Grant had simply moved states, changed the spelling of nothing but the surname he used casually, and started again. "There is one more thing in the file," Callum said, sliding a second sheet across the table. "Dana, the first wife. She remarried 2 years ago, lives outside Sheridan now. We reached out for background. She said something I want to pass along to you directly, because I think it's the kind of thing that helps." He glanced at his notes. "She said Grant was never cruel in the way people expect cruel to look. No yelling, no threats, not at first. She said the whole marriage felt like being slowly overdrawn on an account you didn't know you had. That by the time she understood what was happening, there wasn't much account left." I sat with that phrase for a long moment. Slowly overdrawn. 31 years in banking, and I'd never once heard a truer description of what those 14 months in that house had actually been. "That's the pattern we're building the case around," Callum said. "Which brings me to the second thing." He slid a printout across the table, an account summary showing 3 credit cards opened in the preceding 8 months, each carrying a balance between $6,000 and $9,000, totaling just over $22,000. They were opened in Brooke's name, not mine, hers, without her knowledge. "Your daughter didn't do this to you, Eleanor," Callum said gently. "She didn't know about any of it. As far as we can tell, she's a victim here too. And given the timeline on the forged loan attempt, it looks like Grant was preparing to drain everything he could reach, your equity, her credit, whatever line of debt he could open in either of your names, before disappearing." I sat in that small room and felt something shift that I still don't have a clean word for. Not relief, exactly. Not vindication either, though there was some of that mixed in. Mostly I felt the particular grief of understanding that my daughter and I had both been standing in the same house, being systematically hollowed out by the same man, and neither of us had known the other one was bleeding too. 7 days after I walked out of that house without raising my voice, I had 22 missed calls on my phone, all from Brooke, and one voicemail sitting at the top of them that I never, in 14 months of hoping for something like it, thought I'd actually receive. Her voice was small on the recording, smaller than I'd heard it since she was a girl. "Mom, I found the cards. I found what he did to my credit. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. Please call me back." I called her back before I'd even left the parking lot of the police station. She was crying too hard at first to say much of anything coherent. I sat in my car with the engine off and let her cry, the way I used to when she was small and scraped a knee and needed the sound of my voice more than any particular words in it. When she finally settled enough to talk, she told me she'd gone looking through Grant's laptop 3 days earlier, after the restraining order made him move his things to his brother's place, hunting for the login to a joint streaming account. Instead, she'd found a folder of scanned documents, the 3 credit card statements Callum had already shown me, plus older files from Casper, Wyoming, plus a photograph of a notarized affidavit with my signature on it, badly forged, dated the week before the recliner incident. He was planning to leave, Brooke said, wasn't he? Once the loan came through, he was going to take the $50,000 and go. Oh, I think so, sweetheart. I think that's exactly what he was planning. I defended him. I stood next to him and told my own mother to get him a beer. Her voice broke again. I don't know how to say I'm sorry for that in a way that's big enough. You don't have to say it all today, I told her. You just have to keep telling me the truth from here forward. That's the only part I need. We met in person 3 days later at a coffee shop on Montana Avenue. Neither of us had any particular history with, which felt right somehow. Neutral ground. No memories attached to the booth we chose by the window. Brooke was 7 months pregnant by then, and she looked for the first time in over a year like herself again. Not the careful, managed version of herself she'd learned to perform in that living room. She cried twice before either of us had finished our coffee. I didn't rush her through it. I keep trying to figure out when I stopped being able to tell the difference, she said, turning her mug slowly on the table without drinking from it, between what he wanted me to believe and what I actually believed. I don't think there's a clean line, I said. I spent 14 months apologizing to him for things I didn't do. I'm 67, and I still couldn't always find the line either. He used to tell me you'd never really let me go, that you needed me to still need you, ever since Dad died. I hated how much that made sense at 2 in the morning. She wiped her eyes with a napkin, laughed a little, the sound cracked in the middle. It wasn't even a good lie. It just used the truest thing about you to build something false on top of it. That's usually how it works, I said. The good ones don't invent anything. They just borrow what's already real and point it somewhere else. We didn't solve everything at that table. I don't think a single conversation solves 14 months of anything, but she reached across and took my hand before we left, the first time she'd touched me on purpose since the recliner, and I held on longer than either of us probably expected. Outside on the sidewalk before we split off toward our separate cars, she stopped and said one more thing, quiet, almost to herself. I want Ren to know you the way I knew Dad, not the version I let Grant talk me into. I didn't trust my voice enough to answer that properly. I just nodded and got in my car and cried the whole short drive home in a way that felt, for once, entirely clean. The days after that phone call moved fast, the way things do once a dam finally breaks. Grant's brother Dale called me 2 days later, an unexpected ally in every sense, a quiet, careful man I'd met exactly twice at holiday dinners and never had reason to think much about. He told me he'd suspected something was wrong for over a year, that Grant had asked him for money 3 separate times with stories that never quite lined up, and that he was cooperating fully with Callum's investigation, including handing over texts in which Grant had asked him, 2 weeks before the recliner incident, whether he knew anyone who could make a signature look legit. I should have said something sooner, Dale told me, standing on my new front step with his hands shoved in his jacket pockets, unwilling to come inside even after I offered. I kept telling myself it was between him and his wife, not my business. I told him I understood the impulse better than he probably realized, that I'd spent 14 months telling myself the same kind of thing about my own daughter's marriage. Doesn't make it right, though, he said. Either way, he was the one who told me, unprompted, that Grant had been let go from 2 jobs before Yellowstone Valley Equipment for reasons the family had always described vaguely as personality conflicts, and that their mother had quietly covered a smaller version of this same pattern once before, years earlier, back when Grant was still in his 20s, before Dale had understood what he was actually watching. Brooke's aunt, the same aunt who'd sat through the shrine comment about Walter's recliner and laughed along with everyone else at the table, called to apologize for laughing, which meant more to me than it probably should have, given how small a thing it was against everything else happening. Family lines drew themselves in ways I hadn't predicted. Grant's own mother, a soft-spoken woman named Carol who I'd only met at the wedding, sent Brooke a card with $200 in it and a note that read, simply, I believe you. I'm sorry I didn't ask sooner. She called me herself a week after the bail hearing, her voice careful in the way of someone rehearsing a sentence before saying it out loud. I'm not calling to ask you to go easy on him, she said. I raised him. Whatever he's become, some of it started under my roof, and I've had a long time to think about which parts. She didn't excuse anything. She just wanted me to know Brooke would have somewhere to go on the holidays that didn't include Grant, for as long as she needed it. I hadn't expected kindness from that direction, and I've tried since then not to be surprised anymore by where it turns up. Grant, for his part, did not go quietly. He showed up at Brooke's workplace. She managed the front desk at a dental office on Grand Avenue, twice in 1 week, until her employer, out of concern for the other staff, asked her to take a short leave and had the restraining order added to the building's front desk security notes. He called my cell phone 11 times over 4 days from numbers I didn't recognize, presumably borrowed or prepaid, until Callum's unit added the pattern to the case file as evidence of violation. He tried, once, to sell 3 items of furniture out of the Clark Fork Trail house through an online marketplace before the locks were changed, including, I later found out with a strange, cold kind of anger, Walter's recliner, listed for $60 under the description, man cave chair, somewhere. A neighbor who recognized the listing and recognized the house called Renata's office directly. The sale never went through. I got the recliner back 3 days later, sitting on my new front porch, dropped off by Dale without a word, a small apology delivered in furniture instead of language. There were other complications that fall, the unglamorous kind nobody mentions when they picture a story like this ending in a parking lot. The Clark Fork Trail house, paid off but still generating property tax bills, insurance renewals, and, inconveniently, a water heater that failed in early October while the place sat half-occupied in a strange legal limbo, needed managing even while the case moved forward. straightforward. I hired a property manager, Denise Okafor, mostly to handle the logistics I didn't have the stomach for myself, coordinating a locksmith to change every exterior lock, inventorying what remained once Grant's belongings were removed under police supervision, and locking down the household utility and listing accounts after 2 more attempted online sales of furniture that weren't his to sell. There was a bail hearing in early November. I sat 3 rows behind Carol, close enough to hear her crying quietly into a tissue when the judge set conditions that included no contact with either Brooke or me. I didn't feel triumphant watching that. I felt tired, mostly. The particular exhaustion of watching a system finally do, slowly and procedurally, what should have been obvious to everyone standing in that living room back in September. Grant was arrested on the 18th of October, not primarily for anything that happened in Billings, but on an outstanding warrant out of Natrona County, Wyoming, a warrant tied to the original scheme against Pauline Ashford 9 years earlier, one that had apparently gone unenforced for years due to a clerical gap between jurisdictions, until Callum's unit flagged it while building the Montana case, and Wyoming authorities decided, finally, to act on it. The forgery and attempted fraud charges in Montana came after, along with a separate charge tied to the credit cards opened in Brooke's name, since identity theft against a spouse is still, thankfully, identity theft under Montana law. I felt something the day I heard he'd been taken into custody that surprised me with its complexity. There was satisfaction in it, real and uncomplicated in places, but there was grief threaded through it too, grief I hadn't expected and couldn't fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. I grieved the son-in-law I'd hoped Grant might become when Brooke first brought him home nervous and eager to make a good impression, all those years ago, before I understood what I was actually looking at. I grieved the version of that Christmas dinner where he might have simply been a decent, ordinary man with a drinking problem he was working on, rather than what he turned out to be. Mostly, in a quiet moment alone in my new apartment on a Tuesday evening with Walter's recliner, finally back where I could see it. I grieved the 14 months I'd spent making myself smaller to keep a peace that had never actually existed. A peace that was, I came to understand, just theft wearing a patient face. I found myself, on more than one night that October, sitting in that recliner with Walter's notebook open on my lap, not reading it exactly, just holding it, the way you hold something to prove to yourself that at least one part of your history was real and untampered with. Walter would have hated Grant within the first 10 minutes of meeting him. He had a rancher's instinct for men who talked more than they worked, and some nights I let myself imagine what he might have said, standing in that living room. If he'd lived long enough to hear the words, "old woman," aimed at me, I don't think Grant would have made it past that sentence. I let myself grieve that too, the protection I'd lost when Walter died, the version of this whole story that never would have happened at all if cancer hadn't gotten there first. I found an old photograph that November, tucked in the back of Walter's notebook where I'd never thought to look before. The two of us at Brooke's high school graduation, his arms slung around my shoulders, both of us squinting into a June sun outside the arena downtown. Brooke is barely visible at the edge of the frame, cap askew, laughing at something out of shot. I sat with that photograph longer than I probably should have, turning it over, reading Walter's cramped handwriting on the back. Brooke grad, proud of our girl, and let myself cry the kind of crying I hadn't allowed myself since the hospital room, not for what Grant had done exactly. For every ordinary family dinner Walter never got to have with this version of Brooke, the mother now, the woman rebuilding herself one honest conversation at a time. He would have loved being Ren's grandfather. That loss doesn't show up on any police report or fraud affidavit. It's the one I still feel first, some mornings, before I feel anything else. The legal proceedings stretched out over the following winter, the way these things do. Restitution was ordered for the forged loan attempt, though restitution from a man with no job and mounting legal fees of his own is a promise more than a payment plan. And Renata was honest with me about how much of that money I'd likely ever actually see. The Casper case moved forward separately, with Pauline Ashford, now in her late 70s, agreeing for the first time in 9 years to give a formal statement, something Callum told me she described as a relief nobody had offered her the chance to feel until a stranger in Montana called asking the right questions. Pauline called me herself in December, after Callum passed along my number with both of our permission. We talked for nearly an hour, 2 women in 2 different states who'd never met, comparing notes on a man neither of us had fully understood until it was too late to matter. I used to think it was just me, she said at one point, her voice thin but steady over the line, that I'd done something to invite it, made him think I was an easy mark. I told her I'd thought the same thing about myself more nights than I wanted to admit that fall. It was never about either of us being easy, she said. It was about him being patient. There's a difference, and it took me 9 years to learn it. I wrote that sentence down on a notepad by my phone, the way I used to write down interest rates, and I still have it taped inside Walter's notebook. Brooke filed for divorce in November, 6 weeks before the baby was due, and I sat beside her in the waiting area outside Renata's office both times, holding a paper cup of bad coffee and my daughter's hand in roughly equal measure. The divorce itself moved faster than either of us expected, mostly because Grant, facing criminal charges in 2 states, had little appetite left to contest a division of assets he'd never actually owned outright. Renata negotiated a settlement that left Brooke her car, her retirement account untouched, once the bank agreed to strike the fraudulent credit lines from her name entirely, and full, uncontested custody of the baby. Grant's public defender didn't push back on any of it. Renata's rates were well past what Grant could still afford afford once the Wyoming legal fees started stacking against him. I sat in on the final hearing by choice, not necessity, in the back row of a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Yellowstone County Courthouse, and watched my daughter sign her name to the last document with a steadiness I hadn't seen in her in over a year. The baby, a girl, was born on the 2nd of January. Brooke named her Wren. I held her for the first time in a hospital room, 2 floors up from the one where I'd sat with Walter 3 years earlier, counting ceiling tiles, and I thought about how strange it was that both of the hardest and most tender chapters of my recent life had happened inside the same building, 4 floors apart. I sold the Clark Fork Trail house that spring. I couldn't live in it anymore, not after everything it had absorbed, and Brooke didn't want to either. Too much of Grant was baked into its walls for either of us to feel at ease there. I used part of the proceeds to buy a small 2-bedroom condo 11 minutes from Brooke's new apartment, close enough to help with Ren 3 mornings a week, far enough that neither of us mistakes proximity for obligation anymore. I put the rest into an account for Ren's future, the kind of quiet, unglamorous gift that doesn't come with an ultimatum attached. Susan and I started our Wednesdays again that same spring, first tentatively, then with the old ease returning faster than either of us expected once the thing that had been quietly crowding her out of my life was finally gone. She never said I told you so, though she would have been entitled to. She just showed up the first Wednesday with 2 coffees and sat down across from me at my new kitchen table like no time had passed at all, which I've come to think might be the truest kindness one old friend can offer another. I went back to work in a small way that same spring, not at a bank, but 2 mornings a week at a nonprofit off Broadwater Avenue that helps seniors across Yellowstone County spot financial exploitation before it takes hold. I review paperwork now for people who remind me, more often than I'd like, of myself 18 months earlier, sitting at a kitchen table not wanting to believe what I was looking at. It isn't lost on me that 31 years of reading loan documents for a living didn't stop the same pattern from reaching my own family. I tell the people I work with that plainly, because I think it helps them more than pretending expertise makes anyone immune. I put the rest into an account for Ren's future, the kind of quiet, unglamorous gift that doesn't come with an ultimatum attached. Brooke and I are not exactly what we were before any of this happened. We're something more careful, and I think, in an odd way, more honest. She asks before assuming now. I say what I mean the first time instead of swallowing it to keep a peace I no longer believe is worth that price. We had a hard conversation in February, the 2 of us alone at my kitchen table with Ren asleep in the next room, where Brooke told me she was sorry for every month she'd spent choosing her husband's comfort over her mother's dignity, and I told her the truth, which was that I understood how manipulation works from the inside now in a way I never had before, and that understanding doesn't erase what it cost either of us, but it does make room for forgiveness that isn't the same thing as forgetting. Ren is 8 months old now, and she has Walter's exact stubborn chin, which I noticed the first time she refused a bottle and set her jaw against it the way he used to set his jaw against a piece of machinery that wouldn't cooperate. 2 Saturdays ago, she fell asleep against my shoulder in that recliner while Brooke ran to the store, and I sat there for the better part of an hour rather than risk waking her, watching the light move across the wall, thinking that this, an ordinary, uneventful Saturday, nothing to document, nothing to protect myself against, was the entire thing I'd been fighting for without fully admitting it to myself. Not a courtroom victory, not even the satisfaction of that parking lot, just an ordinary afternoon, safe, with no one in the house who needed managing. I still have Walter's recliner. It sits by the window in my condo, catching the morning light, and some mornings I sit in it with coffee and watch the rims turn that particular gold color they turn in early autumn, and I think about the version of myself who stood in that kitchen 14 months into an arrangement that had quietly become theft, and who finally said calmly, "Then I'll pack." I think about how long it took me to understand that keeping quiet and keeping peace are not the same thing at all, that I had spent most of a marriage and the first year of my widowhood believing silence was a kind of strength, when really, in that house on Clark Fork Trail, it had just been the shape my surrender happened to take. I don't raise my voice now either. That much hasn't changed, and I don't expect it to. It's simply how I've always moved through the world. But no one mistakes my silence for surrender anymore. Not Brooke, who's learned to read the difference. Not Grant, wherever he's serving out what's left of his sentence, who found out the hard way in a bank parking lot that quiet and harmless were never the same word. I lost something in that house I'll never fully get back. A year and change of my daughter's trust. A peace I once believed was real. A small, stubborn hope that my son-in-law might someday become a better man than the one he turned out to be. I let myself grieve all of it on the nights it asks to be grieved. But I got something back too. Sitting in Walter's recliner most mornings with the sun coming up gold over the rims that I don't think I'd have found any other way. The plain, hard-won knowledge that I could smile, pack my bags, and walk out of a room without a single word of anger, and still, in the end, be the one left standing.